What if the most significant move Iran makes in this conflict is not the one announced publicly, not the one tracked by satellites, and not the one that lights up the night sky with missiles? What if the decision that truly reshapes the strategic balance in the Middle East arrives silently, almost unnoticed, disguised not as escalation, but as restraint? And what if by the moment Washington and Tel Aviv fully recognize what has shifted, the assumptions guiding their military planning for decades have already become outdated? As of this week, the ceasefire remains fragile. Public statements continue. Threats are exchanged. Negotiators move between capitals. Presidents speak about peace, while generals prepare for the possibility that peace may not last. But beneath the rhetoric, beneath the televised declarations and the carefully crafted diplomatic language, a much more important process may already be unfolding. Pay close attention to what I'm about to explain, because this is not simply about missiles or uranium or another wave of sanctions. This is about strategic positioning. It is about patience, and it is about an adversary that may have concluded its greatest advantage lies not in what it can destroy immediately, but in what it can force its enemies to fear. There is a discussion taking place among serious military analysts, one that remains largely absent from mainstream coverage. It focuses on what Iran has learned from recent years of confrontation with Israel and the United States, and more importantly, what Tehran may now believe it can do with that knowledge. Because when one studies the direction of Iranian strategy through the cold lens of military history rather than the emotional cycle of daily headlines, a deeply unsettling possibility begins to appear. The most dangerous weapon in modern warfare is often not the one that detonates first. It is the one that forces an adversary to reposition aircraft, spread out naval assets, consume interceptor missiles, and maintain constant readiness at enormous financial and operational cost. The simple existence of a credible threat can reshape the behavior of nations long before the first strike is launched. The British Empire understood this when it deployed fleets across oceans to secure trade routes. The Soviet Union understood it during the nuclear standoff of the Cold War. And now Iran appears to understand a principle as old as strategy itself. If you can impose uncertainty on a stronger opponent, you can force that opponent to exhaust itself preparing for possibilities instead of reacting to realities. Over the last several months, Iran has shown a remarkable level of operational discipline. It has absorbed sanctions, cyber attacks, assassinations, and direct military strikes. Yet it has preserved missile production, expanded drone capabilities, strengthened regional alliances, and continued advancing its nuclear program. This is not the behavior of a state acting impulsively. It is the behavior of a state engaged in long-term strategic preparation. Iranian officials have repeatedly claimed they possess capabilities that have not yet been revealed. Such statements are often dismissed as propaganda, but history shows that states rarely spend billions of dollars across decades merely to make symbolic threats. They do so because they intend to create options that can be used when circumstances become favorable, and that is the critical word, options. The real significance of Iran's recent behavior is not that war is inevitable. It is that Tehran may now believe it possesses a range of strategic options broad enough to challenge both Israel and the United States at the same time. Not necessarily through overwhelming force, but through carefully calibrated pressure applied across multiple domains. Consider the geography of the region. To the north, proxy forces maintain pressure on Israel's borders. To the south, maritime routes remain vulnerable. In the Gulf, energy infrastructure sits within missile range. Across cyberspace, financial systems and communication networks can be targeted without a single soldier crossing a frontier. And at the center of this entire structure stands Iran itself, increasingly confident that it can impose costs on its adversaries far greater than its own expenditures. This is where the strategic balance begins to change. For decades, the prevailing assumption in Washington was that overwhelming military superiority guaranteed escalation dominance. In other words, if the conflict escalated further, the United States and its allies were expected to always impose greater costs than their adversaries could withstand. That assumption still carries weight, but it is no longer beyond challenge. Iran does not need to defeat the United States militarily. It does not need to seize territory. It does not need to win conventional battles. It only needs to convince decision makers that any direct attack on Iran would unleash a chain of consequences so economically disruptive and politically damaging that restraint becomes the more appealing choice. That is deterrence. And when deterrence succeeds, it can appear deceptively like weakness right up until the moment it begins shaping the decisions of far stronger powers. If this kind of unfiltered geopolitical analysis is why you are here, subscribe now, because what comes next is the part most commentary completely overlooks. Iran's next move may not involve launching missiles. It may instead be a strategic demonstration. Imagine for a moment a limited yet coordinated response unfolding across several theaters. Cyber intrusions disrupt shipping databases and insurance systems. Naval forces and allied militias increase pressure near critical maritime choke points. Missile units are placed on visible alert. Proxy groups elevate operational readiness. Oil prices jump. Equity markets react. Shipping insurance premiums across the region surge overnight. No capital city has been hit. No formal declaration of war has been announced. And yet the cost of doing business across the global economy begins rising almost immediately. This is the essence of asymmetric strategy. The global economy functions on confidence, on the assumption that ships will continue moving, aircraft will continue flying, and energy will continue reaching markets on schedule. Introduce uncertainty into those assumptions, and the consequences extend far beyond the battlefield. Investors react. Governments recalculate. Political leaders face pressure not only from military advisors, but also from energy markets, shipping firms, and domestic populations suddenly dealing with higher prices and growing instability. Iran understands this. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. Through this narrow corridor passes a substantial share of the world's seaborne oil trade. Iran does not need to permanently block the strait in order to exert influence. It only needs to convince markets that closure is possible. That possibility alone can send shockwaves through every major economy. For Israel, the challenge is different, but equally serious. Israeli military superiority depends not only on advanced aircraft and missile defenses, but also on uninterrupted resupply, intelligence cooperation, and the confidence that Washington will remain fully committed under escalating conditions. If Iran can create simultaneous crises that stretch the strategic landscape of the Middle East, the region may be approaching one of its most consequential turning points in decades. What makes this moment so dangerous is not simply the possibility of open war, but the growing realization that Iran may no longer be thinking in terms of immediate military victory at all. Instead, Tehran appears increasingly focused on something far more sophisticated and potentially far more effective: the long game of strategic endurance. Within this framework, survival itself becomes a form of victory. Patience becomes a weapon, and uncertainty becomes a tool capable of reshaping the calculations of much stronger adversaries. For years, much of Western policy toward Iran operated on a central assumption that sustained economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and military pressure would eventually force Tehran into major concessions. The expectation was that economic exhaustion would eventually overpower ideological resistance. Yet the events of recent years suggest that Iranian leadership may have reached a very different conclusion. Rather than treating pressure as a temporary hardship, Iran appears to have reorganized its entire national strategy around the belief that endurance itself creates leverage. A state that believes it can absorb pain longer than its opponents becomes far more difficult to coerce. This shift in thinking changes the nature of deterrence entirely. Iran may not require overwhelming conventional superiority to reshape regional calculations. It does not need to defeat the United States militarily or overpower Israel directly. It only needs to persuade its adversaries that the cost of prolonged confrontation is becoming politically, economically, and strategically unsustainable. In modern geopolitics, the ability to impose uncertainty can sometimes matter more than the ability to impose destruction. That may be the logic now emerging from Tehran. Rather than pursuing one dramatic escalation, Iran could instead be positioning itself to present Washington and Tel Aviv with a series of increasingly uncomfortable choices. Every option carries risk. Strike Iran directly, and regional escalation becomes possible. Refrain from action, and deterrence may appear weakened. Escalate militarily, and global energy markets could experience immediate shockwaves. Pursue negotiations, and critics may interpret diplomacy as evidence that pressure has altered Western policy. None of these outcomes offers a clean strategic victory. This is exactly how major geopolitical crises become unstable. History repeatedly shows that wars often begin not because leaders actively seek catastrophic conflict, but because competing powers convince themselves that the other side will eventually retreat first. Miscalculation thrives in environments where confidence exceeds understanding. Leaders begin interpreting restraint as weakness, signals as ultimatums, and ambiguity as preparation for attack. The summer of 1914 remains one of history's clearest warnings. During the July crisis before the First World War, nearly every major European power believed escalation could still be controlled. Political leaders assumed mobilization would strengthen negotiation positions rather than trigger uncontrollable conflict. Alliances, military timetables, domestic politics, and mutual suspicion combined to transform a regional crisis into a global catastrophe. Few intended the scale of destruction that followed. Yet once events accelerated, political control rapidly collapsed. History never repeats itself perfectly, but the structural logic of miscalculation remains remarkably consistent. Iran may believe that carefully calibrated pressure will strengthen deterrence and improve its strategic position. Israel may interpret those same actions as preparation for a much larger attack. The United States may feel compelled to respond in order to preserve credibility with both allies and adversaries. Each decision may appear rational when viewed independently. Together, however, they can create a chain reaction that none of the participants originally intended. What makes the current environment especially significant is the growing perception that Iran feels increasingly confident in its ability to endure prolonged confrontation. Decades of sanctions have forced economic adaptation. Military doctrine has evolved around decentralization, redundancy, and asymmetric warfare. Proxy networks across the region provide strategic depth. Domestic political narratives increasingly frame resistance not as a temporary sacrifice, but as a defining part of national identity. States that believe they can survive pressure tend to negotiate very differently from states that fear imminent collapse. And perhaps most importantly, states that believe time favors them are often willing to wait. This may represent the single most important strategic shift unfolding beneath the surface of current events. For much of the last 2 decades, Western strategy operated on the assumption that Iran was ultimately racing against time. Tehran's recent posture, however, suggests Iranian leadership may now believe the opposite, that its adversaries are the ones constrained by time. Democratic election cycles, economic sensitivities, alliance management, public opinion, energy prices, and instability in financial markets all create pressures that can limit long-term strategic patience in Washington and Tel Aviv. If Iranian leadership truly believes this, then its next move may not be designed purely as retaliation. It may instead be intended as a test of whether the United States and Israel remain politically willing to sustain the rising costs of confrontation indefinitely. Such a strategy would not necessarily require a massive military assault. In fact, the most effective move may be something far more subtle, a calibrated maritime incident in the Persian Gulf, a sophisticated cyber operation targeting regional infrastructure, a coordinated proxy escalation across multiple fronts, a dramatic announcement regarding uranium enrichment levels, or perhaps a carefully synchronized combination of all these actions carried out in a way that maximizes ambiguity while preserving plausible deniability. The objective would not necessarily be immediate military victory. The objective would be strategic shock. Not shock created by overwhelming destruction, but shock caused by the sudden realization that Iran may possess more resilience, more flexibility, and more leverage than many policymakers have publicly acknowledged. The psychological effect of uncertainty can often exceed the immediate impact of direct confrontation. Markets react to fear before they react to facts. Alliances become strained under pressure. Public confidence weakens when leaders appear uncertain about escalation risks. What happens if global oil prices surge dramatically within days? What if insurers suddenly decide Gulf shipping routes are too dangerous for normal commercial operations? What if Israel faces simultaneous pressure across multiple regional fronts while the United States remains strategically divided between Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific? These are no longer abstract hypotheticals. They are increasingly central calculations shaping military planning rooms, intelligence assessments, and diplomatic discussions around the world. Yet intellectual honesty also requires acknowledging Iran's limitations. The country faces serious economic pressures. Infrastructure vulnerabilities remain significant. Domestic politics are complex and at times volatile. Iranian leadership understands that uncontrolled escalation could impose devastating costs on the regime itself. Capability does not guarantee action. Preparation does not ensure execution. And deterrence is never absolute. Still, history teaches that states do not spend decades building strategic tools unless they expect those tools to matter during moments of crisis. Even capabilities that are never fully used can dramatically influence decision-making simply through their existence. The mere possibility of escalation changes calculations. The mere presence of uncertainty alters behavior. That is why this moment deserves such close attention. The greatest danger may not be a sudden apocalyptic war. The greater danger may be something far more manageable in appearance, yet far more transformative in consequence. A move subtle enough to appear limited, but significant enough to permanently alter strategic assumptions overnight. A move that forces Washington and Tel Aviv to confront the possibility that the regional balance has evolved more profoundly than previously believed. And if that realization arrives, the shock will not come from irrationality. The shock will come from the perception that Iran acted with patience, discipline, and strategic clarity. What political leaders owe their citizens now is not simplistic reassurance or theatrical rhetoric. They owe an honest recognition that the Middle East may be entering a new strategic era, one in which military power is measured not only by aircraft carriers, missiles, or air superiority, but also by resilience, endurance, leverage, and the ability to impose uncertainty on adversaries with greater conventional resources. Modern power is no longer defined solely by the capacity to destroy. Increasingly, it is defined by the capacity to shape the choices available to others. Iran appears increasingly determined to demonstrate exactly that principle. Whether its next move emerges through negotiation tactics, regional proxy pressure, cyber escalation, maritime disruption, or symbolic military signaling, the broader objective may remain the same: convincing its opponents that underestimating Iran carries costs far greater than many policymakers have been willing to publicly acknowledge. If that message is delivered effectively, the consequences will extend far beyond the Middle East itself. Energy markets would react immediately. Global alliances could begin recalibrating strategic priorities. Military planners around the world would revise assumptions about deterrence and regional stability. Political leaders would face difficult choices they hoped to avoid. And ordinary citizens far removed from any battlefield could still feel the impact through inflation, rising energy costs, disrupted trade routes, and growing economic uncertainty. The most important changes in international politics rarely announce themselves clearly at first. They emerge gradually beneath the surface, quietly accumulating pressure until a single event suddenly reveals that the geopolitical environment has already transformed. That may be where the world stands today. Iran's next move may shock Israel and the United States not because it is unimaginable, but because it could expose how much of the strategic landscape has been misunderstood for years. And if that moment arrives, the greatest surprise may not be what Iran does next. The greatest surprise may be how many warning signs were visible all along.